The morning air was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed against the walls and demanded to be felt. Eleanor held the folded letter in her trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the words that seemed to burn into her memory. The narrator whispered that the truth had a way of arriving uninvited, and now it stood in her small kitchen like a shadow she could not escape. Eleanor said, "Why now? Why after all these years?" Her voice cracked as though her throat could no longer bear the weight of grief. The kettle whistled faintly, forgotten on the stove, while her reflection in the window revealed a face broken between rage and despair. She dropped the letter, and it floated to the floor like a leaf surrendering to gravity, carrying with it the end of everything she thought she knew. The narrator declared that this was the day she chose to forget, yet the truth would not let her. The narrator observed how silence spread through the kitchen like spilled ink, staining every corner with despair. Eleanor's thoughts circled back to the letter, though her eyes refused to meet it again. She pressed her palm against the counter, grounding herself against the trembling of her body. Eleanor said, "It cannot be true, not him, not us." Her voice was brittle, as though it might shatter with the weight of her denial. She forced her gaze toward the clock on the wall, its ticking louder than her own heartbeat. Each passing second was a reminder that the world would not pause for her grief. The narrator spoke of how time was cruel, dragging her forward when all she wanted was to remain in the moment before the truth arrived. The narrator whispered that grief clung to Eleanor like a second skin, one she could not shed. She reached for the kettle, its handle hot against her palm, and set it aside with trembling care. Steam rose like a ghost, reminding her of the life she thought she knew. Eleanor said, "If I close my eyes, maybe this will vanish." Her breath was uneven, breaking in rhythm with the ticking clock. She lowered herself into the chair, her hands clutching her knees, desperate for grounding. The chair creaked under her fragile weight, the sound magnified by silence. The narrator declared that forgetting was not a choice of will but of surrender, and Eleanor had not yet learned to surrender. The narrator described how Eleanor's memories surged forward like a flood, fragments of laughter and warmth clashing with the ache of betrayal. She clasped her temples, fighting the images that refused to fade. Eleanor said, "I gave everything, and this is what remains." Her voice fractured as she spoke, echoing in the hollow space. The sound of distant bird song outside mocked her despair, reminding her that life beyond these walls continued. She pressed her forehead against the table, letting the wood's cool surface anchor her spinning mind. The narrator whispered that the heart always remembers, even when the mind wishes to forget. The narrator noted that Eleanor's tears finally fell, tracing paths down her cheeks like rivers carving valleys. She no longer fought the grief, but allowed it to overtake her. Her sobs were quiet, restrained, as though she feared the world might hear her brokenness. Eleanor said, "I cannot carry this anymore." Her shoulders shook beneath the weight of her confession. The letter lay at her feet, untouched but still alive with its cruel truth. She curled her knees against her chest, rocking slowly, seeking comfort where none remained. The narrator whispered that pain demands to be felt, and Eleanor had only begun to learn its depth. The narrator revealed how Eleanor lingered at the window, staring into the world beyond, as though searching for an answer the sky might hold. Her body was weary, yet her spirit clung to fragments of longing. She pressed her hand against the glass, the cold seeping into her skin like the truth she could not shake. Eleanor said, "I only wanted peace, a place where my heart could rest." Her eyes reflected both the ache of loss and the fragile hope she could not abandon. The street outside carried on as if untouched by her pain, a cruel reminder of life's indifference. The narrator explained that within her the hunger for healing grew louder than her grief, demanding to be heard. The narrator spoke of how grief softened when memory reached out for love. Eleanor remembered the warmth of her mother's embrace, the voice that once told her she was strong enough to face storms. She sank into the armchair, clutching a worn photo frame, her thumb brushing over the faces frozen in time. Eleanor said, "You believed in me when I could not." Her voice trembled with gratitude and sorrow. The memory steadied her heartbeat, a faint anchor in the storm. The narrator whispered that even in the abyss, love's echo remained, guiding her toward herself again. The narrator described how the knock at the door startled Eleanor, pulling her back to the present. It was Michael, her lifelong confidant, who carried with him the quiet strength of loyalty. His eyes scanned her face, heavy with worry yet gentle in their knowing. Michael said, "You do not have to walk through this alone." She faltered, her lips parting but no words coming, only the trembling silence of someone who wished to believe. The narrator explained that in Michael's presence the weight of her grief shifted slightly, though her heart feared leaning too much on hope. The narrator revealed how Eleanor let Michael inside, his steady presence filling the emptiness of her home. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, his voice calm yet firm, as if grounding her with every word. Michael said, "Pain may change you, but it does not erase you." Her eyes glistened, her breath shallow, as though each word carved both comfort and ache. The kettle hissed faintly, a ghost of her earlier turmoil, while the letter still lay on the floor between them. The narrator whispered that Michael's loyalty offered her a mirror, showing the strength she had forgotten. The narrator described how silence stretched between them, not heavy but sacred, like a space carved for healing. Eleanor clutched her robe tighter, as if shielding the fragile pieces of herself. Michael reached across the table, his hand steady, his voice quiet. Michael said, "Let the pain out, not bury it." A tear slipped down her cheek, not with despair but with recognition. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a world where grief might not define her. The narrator whispered that this was the seed of change, a fragile spark that would one day grow into strength. The narrator described how night crept into Eleanor's home, bringing with it the sharp edge of doubt. Though Michael's words lingered, the silence within her felt heavier than before. She paced across the living room, her robe brushing against the floor, her mind circling back to the letter she had tried to abandon. Eleanor said, "Every line cuts me again, as if the ink itself carries the betrayal." Her voice cracked, brittle in the quiet. Outside, the wind rattled the window, echoing her restlessness. The narrator whispered that wounds unacknowledged never healed, and the truth now stood like a storm pressing against her fragile frame. The narrator revealed how Eleanor's heart clenched when she saw Daniel's name still written across the envelope, the man she had once trusted beyond measure. His absence was louder than his presence ever had been. She lifted the letter again, her fingers trembling, but her eyes refused to read it anew. Eleanor said, "How could you carve lies into the place where love once lived?" Her words faltered, as if she feared the walls might answer her back. The narrator whispered that love betrayed was a knife that never dulled, and in her silence, Eleanor bled. The narrator described how Michael returned the next evening, his face lined with concern. He stepped inside and found Eleanor gripping the envelope like a weapon she both feared and refused to surrender. Michael said, "Don't let his shadow steal more of you." His tone carried both firmness and compassion. Eleanor lowered her gaze, her shoulders slumping, yet her lips trembled as if words burned to escape. She said, "You don't know what it feels like to lose yourself in someone's lies." The narrator whispered that the truth was now a battlefield, and her soul was caught in the fire. The narrator revealed how tension thickened as Eleanor's anger broke through grief. She slammed the letter onto the table, her breath sharp, her eyes wild with unspoken truths. Eleanor said, "He promised me forever, and now forever feels like a cruel joke." Her words trembled between fury and despair. Michael leaned back, giving her the space to unleash the storm, his silence a form of strength. The narrator whispered that fury was the mask grief often wore, and Eleanor was only beginning to face the face beneath. The narrator described how Eleanor collapsed into the chair, her fury exhausted into trembling sobs. Michael moved closer, his hand hovering before resting lightly on her shoulder, grounding her with quiet presence. Eleanor said, "I don't even know who I am without the pieces he left behind." Her voice was fragile, a confession of identity lost. Michael replied softly, "You are still here, Eleanor, and that is enough for now." The narrator whispered that truth had torn her open, but in the space of breaking, there was also the seed of becoming. The The narrator described how Eleanor stood alone in the attic, the air thick with dust and forgotten years. She opened an old trunk, her hands trembling as she unearthed letters not meant for her. Each word revealed that Daniel had carried secrets deeper than she imagined. Eleanor said, "It wasn't just betrayal. It was a life I never knew he lived." Her voice cracked under the weight of discovery. The room seemed to shrink, pressing her closer to truths she had avoided. The narrator whispered that revelation is both dagger and mirror, cutting through illusion while forcing one to see what was hidden all along. The narrator revealed how Eleanor's breath quickened as she read a letter addressed to another woman, dated years before their vows. The handwriting was Daniel's, unmistakable and cruelly intimate. Her hands shook as though the paper itself burned. Eleanor said, "So love was never mine alone." Her voice trembled, half fury, half heartbreak. Outside, thunder rumbled, as if the sky conspired to echo her revelation. The narrator whispered that betrayal was no longer abstract. It lived in ink, undeniable, permanent, and merciless. The narrator described how Michael entered quietly, his footsteps cautious as he saw Eleanor trembling over the letters. He bent down beside her, his expression torn between sorrow and resolve. Michael said, "You deserve the truth, even when it breaks you." Eleanor lifted her eyes, red and swollen, her lips quivering as though confession and collapse battled within her. She said, "He lived a life I was never part of, and I was blind." The narrator whispered that the cruelest pain was not in losing love, but realizing it was never fully hers. The narrator revealed how Eleanor's voice rose with anger, her grief igniting into fury. She hurled one of the letters across the room, its pages scattering like torn promises. Eleanor said, "He built me on lies, and I loved him for it." Her voice echoed through the attic, raw and ragged. Michael remained silent, his steady presence a quiet anchor amid her storm. The narrator whispered, "That rage is the twin of grief, demanding release when sorrow alone cannot carry the weight of betrayal." The narrator described how silence returned after her outburst, the kind that hummed with exhaustion. Eleanor sank to her knees, her breath unsteady, her body folding under grief. Michael reached out, lifting one of the scattered pages, his eyes soft with compassion yet unflinching in their truth. Michael said, "The lies were his, but the strength to rise is yours." Eleanor met his gaze, her tears slowing, a fragile spark of recognition forming in her brokenness. The narrator whispered that revelation did not end her, it remade her piece by painful piece. The narrator described how Eleanor stood in the rain-soaked graveyard, the storm above mirroring the turmoil within her. She clutched the final letter she had found, her fingers trembling as though holding a blade. Eleanor said, "This ends here, with you, Daniel." Her voice broke into the storm, sharp and raw. She dropped the letter onto the grave, watching the ink dissolve into the wet soil. The narrator whispered that the climax of grief is not silence but a scream against the sky, and Eleanor's scream was the breaking point of her soul. The narrator revealed how Michael stood behind her, drenched but steadfast, watching her shatter into pieces she had tried to hold together. He wanted to intervene but knew this storm belonged to her. Eleanor screamed, "You built me on lies, and I carried them like truth." Her words cracked like lightning, shaking her body with release. Michael's silence was heavy but protective, a shield of presence in the downpour. The narrator whispered that release is born in fire, and her fire raged until nothing remained but ashes. The narrator described how Eleanor fell to her knees, the mud staining her coat, her body trembling with exhaustion. Michael rushed forward, kneeling beside her, his hand steady on her back. Eleanor sobbed, "I don't know how to live with this." Her voice was faint, hollow, stripped bare. Michael leaned close, whispering with quiet resolve, "You live by choosing yourself, not the lies he left." The narrator whispered that the climax of pain is the seed of rebirth, and in her collapse, Eleanor found the fragile roots of strength. The narrator revealed how Eleanor lifted her gaze to the storm, her chest heaving, her eyes red but alive. She whispered into the night, her voice raw yet certain, Eleanor said, "You no longer own me, Daniel." The words cut through the rain like a vow, fierce and final. Michael's eyes softened, his breath visible in the cold, knowing she had crossed the line between despair and survival. The narrator whispered that the climax was not in defeat, but in reclaiming her voice, a roar disguised as a whisper against the storm. The narrator described how Eleanor rose slowly, her body heavy with grief yet upright with resolve. She took Michael's hand, not as someone who needed saving, but as one who had chosen to stand. Eleanor said, "I will not be defined by his shadow." Her words trembled, but did not break. Michael nodded, his silence carrying the weight of respect. The narrator whispered that in this storm she faced her breaking, but also her becoming, and with each raindrop that fell, she stepped further from the grave of lies into the soil of her own truth. The narrator described how dawn crept gently into Eleanor's home, painting the walls with soft gold instead of shadows. She sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, her breathing calm, though her eyes still carried faint sorrow. Eleanor said, "The storm passed and so did the lies." Her words were soft, spoken more to herself than to anyone else. The kettle hummed quietly in the background, no longer a haunting echo but a reminder of ordinary life returning. The narrator whispered that healing is never sudden, but in this moment, Eleanor began to taste peace for the first time. The narrator revealed how Michael returned, his knock no longer carrying urgency but comfort. She opened the door, and the morning breeze carried with it the scent of wet earth after rain. Michael smiled faintly, his eyes warm with relief. Michael said, "You look lighter today." Eleanor returned a small, tired smile, replying, "Maybe for the first time, I do." Their words were brief but full, a language of shared survival. The narrator whispered that companionship is not about mending wounds but about reminding one another that life continues, even after it breaks. The narrator described how they sat together in the garden, where raindrops still clung to leaves like silver beads. Eleanor's hands rested in her lap, no longer trembling. Michael leaned back, his voice steady as he said, "The scars will remain, but they don't own you." Eleanor looked at the sky, her lips parting into a faint smile. She said, "Maybe that is enough, to live with scars but not let them rule me." The narrator whispered that healing begins when the heart accepts both its cracks and its light, coexisting without shame. The narrator revealed how Eleanor returned to the attic, not to reopen wounds but to close them with intention. She gathered the scattered letters, her movements steady and deliberate. With each one, she whispered a farewell, letting them fall into the fire that crackled in the hearth below. Eleanor said, "You no longer live here." Her tone was firm, not trembling but resolute. The narrator whispered that healing is not erasing the past, but choosing to no longer let it define the present, and Eleanor chose herself above the ruins of lies. The narrator described how the evening settled with calm, the house no longer a cage but a sanctuary. Eleanor stood at the window once more, gazing outward, but this time her reflection carried strength rather than despair. Michael's voice reached her gently from behind. "You've found your ground again." Eleanor touched the glass, whispering, "I have." The narrator whispered that resolution is not forgetting. It is choosing to carry the past as a story, not a chain, and Eleanor had taken her first full step into herself. The narrator described how the morning light fell across Eleanor's face as she walked along the quiet path leading out of town. The weight that once bent her shoulders had lifted, though faint scars remained in her eyes. She inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling her chest like a promise. Eleanor whispered, "I am still here." The words were not fragile but steady, spoken into the stillness of dawn. The narrator whispered that survival is not forgetting but carrying truth without surrendering to it, and Eleanor had chosen to live on her terms. The narrator revealed how Michael walked a few paces behind, not as savior but as companion, his presence steady but unintrusive. He watched her reclaim each step with quiet pride. Michael said, "Every step is yours, Eleanor." She turned slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile. Eleanor replied, "And finally, I choose to take them." The narrator whispered that healing is not found in another's shadow, but in one's own courage, and hers now glowed like the rising sun. The narrator described how Eleanor paused by the riverbank, watching the water carry fallen leaves away. Her reflection shimmered, no longer fractured but whole. She bent down, dipping her hand into the current, letting the cold sting remind her of life's flow. Eleanor said, "The past drifts, but I remain." Her voice was calm, anchored in truth. The narrator whispered that acceptance is not an end but a beginning, and in this moment she chose herself as her own anchor. The narrator revealed how Eleanor and Michael reached the old oak tree that once stood as her childhood refuge. She placed her hand on its weathered bark, her touch steady, her breath slow. Eleanor said, "This is where I begin again." Her words carried no sorrow, only quiet resolve. Michael stood beside her, silent but present, his gaze soft as though witnessing a rebirth. The narrator whispered that closure is not found in forgetting, but in planting oneself firmly in the soil of now, where roots can grow anew. The narrator described how Eleanor sat on a bench overlooking the horizon, the sun rising fully now, painting the sky with shades of gold and crimson. She closed her eyes, her breath deep and steady, her lips forming words only she could hear. Eleanor whispered, "I am not what I lost. I am what I choose." A single tear slipped down her cheek, not of sorrow but release. Michael remained a silhouette beside her, quiet as the world awakened. The narrator whispered that the story ended not with forgetting, but with a woman who chose herself above all else.